It began on a quiet Monday morning in late autumn, the kind of day where the world seems to hold its breath, before winter truly arrives. In Millford, Pennsylvania, frost still clung to the grass. A pale mist curled at the edges of lawns where the weak sun hadn't yet touched, and the neighborhood moved slowly into its day. A few people scraped ice from windshields. Others sipped coffee on their porches, the steam ghosting into the air. The quiet was broken by the low rumble of an ambulance turning onto Oak Ridge Road. It moved without urgency, tires crunching over gravel as it rolled up the cracked driveway of a faded blue clapboard house at the edge of town. The Hensley place was the kind of house people passed without thinking twice. Sagging porch roof, flaking paint, one shutter hanging at a lazy angle. For decades it had been home to Thomas Hensley and, for the last 30 years, his son Robert, Bobby Hensley. They were known in Millford, but not known well. The kind of family that kept to themselves, kept their blinds drawn, and kept their business behind closed doors. Inside the ambulance, two paramedics exchanged a brief glance. The call had been straightforward. Elderly, male, found unresponsive by family. Expected natural death. No obvious signs of foul play. When the door opened, the first thing the paramedics noticed was the dimness. Every curtain was drawn tight, blocking out the pale light of morning. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying a faint odor of stale sheets. And something sharper, the metallic tang of illness left untended. The bedroom door stood half open. Thomas Hensley lay on his back in a sunken bed, head tilted slightly toward the curtained window as though he had been waiting for something that never came. His skin clung tight to the bones beneath. His lips were cracked. His eyes, half open, had dulled into the glassy stare of someone gone for hours. On the nightstand was a water glass, bone dry. One of the EMTs, Perry, 20 years on the job, frowned. He glanced at his partner. Looks like dehydration. The younger paramedic hesitated. Could just be the illness. He was in bad shape, right? Perry shook his head. This doesn't happen overnight. In the doorway stood Bobby Hensley, 51 years old, wearing a sweatshirt stained at the collar. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, not flushed with grief, not frozen in shock, just still. Didn't wake up this morning, he said flatly. Wasn't much I could do. It might have ended there. The coroner could have chalked it up to age, and Millford would have moved on. But 2 days later, when the coroner's report came back, it didn't just say natural causes. It said dehydration. And in the margin, in the coroner's careful hand, was a single word that would turn this quiet death into a case that would consume the town. Suspicious Bobby Hensley wasn't known for ambition. At 51, he had never married, never had children, never held a steady job for more than a year or two. He had never lived anywhere but his father's house. Thomas Hensley had been a railroad man for decades. Long shifts, long miles, and a reputation for being as unyielding as steel. He wasn't the kind of man you argued with and won. Bobby had been the quiet son, obedient in the way children of hard fathers often are. He mowed the lawn when told, ran errands, and otherwise disappeared into the background. When Thomas retired, Bobby stayed on in the house, gradually taking on the role of his father's caretaker. To outsiders, it sounded like an act of loyalty, admirable, even. But those who paid closer attention noticed things. The blinds stayed closed even on the sunniest days. Visitors weren't welcomed inside. The grocery deliveries were small, rarely containing fresh produce. And sometimes, late at night, neighbors heard voices from inside. Thomas's, weak and strained. Bobby's, sharper, impatient. None of it seemed like more than family friction. Not until the coroner's finding hit the evening news. Millford was small enough that news didn't just travel. It spread like spilled ink, soaking into every conversation. Dehydration. Mrs. Carter, who lived across the street, said to her neighbor over the fence, "How does someone die of that when their own son lives under the same roof?" 2 days after the funeral, a pair of detectives arrived at the Hensley house. They started with simple questions. Bobby's answers were equally simple. Dad was old. He barely ate, barely drank. It was his time. I did the best I could. But when they asked how he'd tried to help, the answers got vague. Where were the medical records? Didn't need them. Dad didn't trust doctors. Prescriptions? He didn't take any. A care plan? We just took it day by day. Then came the first crack in his story. The local pharmacist told police Thomas hadn't picked up his prescribed medications in more than 4 months. Bobby had insisted they were up to date. The search warrant came through on a rainy Thursday. Inside, the house was far from what you'd expect in a home where a full-time caretaker lived. The kitchen sink was stacked with unwashed dishes. Expired food crowded the counters. The refrigerator held condiments, a carton of milk long past sour, and several bottles of beer. Thomas's bedroom was worse. A thin blanket twisted at the foot of the bed, the dry water glass still on the nightstand, a plastic urinal on the floor half full and clearly untouched for days. There was no medical equipment. No blood pressure cuff, no feeding tubes, no forstand. The blinds in the bedroom were nailed shut. Neighbors later recalled overhearing arguments. One woman, walking her dog at night, had heard Bobby's voice through the thin walls. "If you're not going to eat, then don't expect me to wait on you." The financial records deepened suspicion. Bobby had no job and no official caregiver income. Yet, in the past year, nearly $40,000 had been withdrawn from Thomas's bank accounts, all in cash. Bobby also had more than $12,000 in credit card debt, much of it tied to online gambling. Friends remembered him complaining about being tied down by caring for his father. If it wasn't for him, he'd say, "I could have my own life." The coroner's autopsy pushed the case into darker territory. Yes, Thomas had arthritis and heart issues, but nothing immediately fatal. What killed him was severe dehydration, bad enough that his kidneys had begun to fail days before his death. The coroner explained, "Without water, the body shuts down organ by organ. The lips crack, the tongue swells, confusion sets in, then seizures, then coma. It's slow, it's painful, and it doesn't happen unless someone can't, or won't, give you water." With basic hydration, Thomas could have lived weeks, maybe months longer. Elaine Hensley, Bobby's younger sister, who lived 2 states away, hadn't been to the house in years. But when detectives called, her voice caught before she even said hello. "I warned Dad about Bobby," she told them. She described phone calls in which Thomas whispered that he was hungry, that Bobby forgot to bring him water. When she offered to visit, Bobby told her there was no need and that she'd just upset him. "I think Dad was scared of him," she said. 2 weeks later, the police came back. Bobby answered the door in sweatpants, coffee mug in hand. Detective Harris read him his rights and told him he was under arrest for involuntary manslaughter and neglect of a care-dependent person. Bobby laughed once, short, bitter. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to take care of him for years?" It was the kind of remark juries remember. 2 weeks after Bobby's arrest, Elaine was in her father's bedroom, pulling shirts from a dresser drawer to donate to the church when something crackled under her hand. Folded between 2 flannel shirts was a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was shaky, the lines wandering uphill across the page. "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." There was no signature, no date, but Elaine recognized the handwriting instantly. She'd seen it on birthday, cards, grocery lists, and notes tacked to the refrigerator for most of her life. It was Thomas's. Her first instinct was disbelief. Her second was dread. She brought it to the prosecutor's office the next morning. They treated it as a possible dying declaration, something jurors could take seriously if they believed it was written in Thomas's final days. But the defense was ready with their counter. "This could have been written years ago," they said. "It could have been about anything. It could be the ramblings of an old man in failing health." The note was placed in an evidence bag, but in the minds of those who'd seen it, it had already shifted the ground. The trial opened in late March, and from the first day, the courtroom was packed. Milford's courthouse wasn't. Large, 40 seats in the gallery, another dozen for press, but every inch was taken. Townspeople, local, reporters, and a few strangers from outside the county, all there to see if the man accused of letting his father die of thirst would be convicted. The prosecution began by painting Bobby as a selfish, resentful man who had lived off his father's dwindling resources, resenting every day he had to play caretaker. They called medical experts to describe the agony of dehydration so the jury would feel its slow cruelty. Elaine took the stand to recall the whispered phone calls, her father's fear barely audible over the static. The defense told a different story. Bobby was a man doing his best for a stubborn father who refused medical care, refused food, and refused water in his final days. They called neighbors who said Thomas had told them more than once, "When it's my time, I'm ready." The jury sat in still-faced silence, eyes moving between the witnesses and the man at the defense table. On the fourth day, the prosecution called an unexpected witness. Victor Alvarez, the Hensleys' next-door neighbor. Alvarez told the court that 3 days before Thomas died, he went to return a borrowed ladder. As he passed the side of the house, he heard Thomas's voice through the slightly open bedroom window. The voice was hoarse, pleading. "Just a sip of water, Bobby, please." Bobby's reply came sharp. "You've had enough. Go back to sleep." The room went still. Several jurors shifted in their seats. The defense attacked the testimony immediately on cross-examination. Could Alvarez really have heard that clearly through curtains? Could it have been a TV program? And wasn't it true that he'd had an ongoing property line dispute with Bobby years earlier? Doubt crept in at the edges. The prosecution was ready for that. The next morning, they revealed they had recovered a deleted voicemail from Elaine's phone backup. The recording was faint, but Thomas's voice was unmistakable. Fragile. Ragged. "I don't think I'm gonna make it. He won't give me water. Tell someone." The timestamp placed it 2 days before Thomas's death. Bobby stared straight ahead as it played, jaw tight. Elaine pressed a tissue to her mouth. The jury didn't move, but the mood in the room shifted again, away from doubt and back toward suspicion. That afternoon, during a short recess, Bobby leaned toward his attorney and spoke a few words too quiet for anyone else to hear. Whatever he said made the lawyer's face pale. The attorney immediately requested a conference with the judge in chambers. The rumor spread before the court was called back into session. Bobby had told his attorney, "I didn't act alone." The next morning, the prosecution called a new witness. Lila Ortiz walked to the stand carrying a worn leather satchel. She was in her late 40s, her hair pulled back, her face lined with the fatigue of someone who'd spent too many years trying to do too much with too little. Ortiz worked for Adult Protective Services. She testified that 6 months before Thomas's death, their office had received an anonymous call reporting possible neglect at the Hensley home. Specifically, that an elderly man was being left without water for long stretches. The call was marked urgent, but Ortiz had 49 open cases and 2 colleagues on leave. Took 8 weeks to get to Oak Ridge Road. When she knocked, no one answered. She left a card. 2 weeks later, she returned and heard movement inside, but a man's voice, she couldn't say whose, told her everything was fine and refused to open the door without a warrant. The phone number from the anonymous call traced to a prepaid cell phone bought for cash at a convenience store. No name, no address. That night, in a rented apartment 2 towns over, a freelance reporter named Maya Chun opened her email to find a message with no subject line. The body was empty except for an attachment. It was a video file. The footage was grainy, the angle high, like from a security camera in the corner of the room. Thomas lay in bed, his face turned toward the doorway. He whispered something. The audio caught it faintly. "Water!" A woman entered the frame. She wasn't Elaine. She wasn't anyone Maya recognized from court. Mid-50s, pale hair tucked neatly behind her ears, a scarf draped over her shoulders. She moved the glass of water on the nightstand farther from Thomas's reach. "It's better if you rest," she said softly. Water only confuses the body at this stage. From the doorway, Bobby's voice answered, "You said not to." The woman leaned close to Thomas. "Trust the process." Maya sat back from the screen. She recognized the cadence in that phrase. She'd heard it in a hospice interview she'd covered a year ago. She dug through her notes and found the name, Margaret Pine. The video went to the prosecutor's office within the hour. The next day in court, the prosecution played the clip on the big monitor. The jurors leaned forward, their faces lit by the ghostly glow of the footage. "This," the prosecutor said, "is not a licensed nurse. This is Margaret Pine, a woman with no medical credentials, no hospice affiliation, and a long history of inserting herself into end-of-life situations." Elaine was called back to the stand. She admitted she'd invited Margaret into the house after meeting her through an online caregiver forum. "I thought she could make him comfortable," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't know she would tell Bobby to stop giving him water." The defense seized on the admission. If Margaret was directing Bobby, why wasn't she the one on trial? But the prosecution's answer was simple. Because Bobby Hensley listened. Detective Harris testified next. He held up a cracked leather-bound ledger. It had been found in a car registered to Margaret Pine, abandoned on a dirt road 2 counties away. Inside were dozens of names and dates. Next to each was one of 2 columns, peaceful or difficult, each marked with a check. Thomas Hensley's name was there. The date matched the day he died. His entry was checked under peaceful. The ledger changed the mood of the courtroom. What had begun as a narrow case about one man's death now felt like the exposed tip of something much larger, a pattern that spanned years and possibly counties. Margaret Pine had vanished before the subpoena could be served. The warrant for her arrest went statewide, but the deputies chasing her trailed only rumors. A pale-haired woman seen at a rural gas station, a scarf spotted on a bus in the next county. Nothing confirmed. The prosecution's strategy shifted. They didn't just want to prove Bobby's neglect. They wanted to show he had become part of someone else's system. The defense tried to block every reference to other names in the ledger, but the jury had already seen enough to know that Thomas Hensley's death wasn't the only one. Detective Harris kept digging during recesses. His breakthrough came from a tip in a place he hadn't expected: the Hensley basement. The space was mostly storage, boxes of old tools, broken furniture, jars of rusting nails. But behind the water heater, wedged between the concrete wall and the metal shell, he found a plastic sleeve wrapped in a torn garbage bag. Inside was a property deed for a 14-acre plot of land outside town. The owner listed, Caleb Hensley. Harris froze. Caleb was Bobby and Elaine's middle brother, the one who had left home at 16 and never returned. Most people in Millford hadn't spoken his name in decades. The sleeve also contained 3 letters written in Thomas's familiar, blocky handwriting, a black and white photograph of a teenage boy with a bruise blooming on his cheek, and an envelope marked, for Caleb. Inside the envelope was a note. "Caleb, if you find this, it means I didn't make it right in time. The papers will give you what's yours. They can't say I didn't try. I kept them hidden so she couldn't take it. She took enough already. Tell Bobby and Ellie the truth if you can stomach it. I never could. Or Dad." No date, no name for she. But Harris suspected the pronoun wasn't aimed at Elaine. That same evening, in a second-floor walk-up 2 towns away, Maya Chun received another anonymous email. Subject: check the property on the deed body. Bring a camera. The GPS pin led her down a narrowing dirt road through pine scrub to a small 1-story cabin with sagging shutters. The mailbox hung open, swinging gently in the wind. On the ground outside were 2 sets of boot prints. One large, one smaller, child-sized. Inside, the cabin smelled of cold ash and old pennies. A tin cup sat on the mantel above an unlit fireplace. Above it, tacked to the wall, was a yellowed newspaper clipping. Local woman offers natural passing care to families. The photograph showed Margaret Pine, smiling faintly. Across the clipping, someone had scrawled in thick black marker, "Not alone." In the corner was a stack of manila folders. Most were intake forms, handwritten notes, and pamphlets identical to those found in Margaret's abandoned car. At the bottom of the pile was a folder labeled Hensley, Thomas. The first page wasn't in Margaret's hand. It was Thomas's, the same blunt script as the basement letters. Day 4, voice still asking for water. Explained again. She says every sip is a step backward. Bobby stays out of the room now. Easier this way. Maya photographed every page before she left. 2 days later, just after court adjourned for lunch, a man in a hooded jacket walked into the courthouse lobby. The deputy stiffened until he pushed the hood back. Elaine gasped. He was older now, with gray streaks in his beard and lines carved by years, but the eyes were unmistakable. Caleb Hensley. He walked straight to Detective Harris. "He was waiting for me," he said. "Where have you been?" Harris asked. "Everywhere," Caleb said. "Nowhere that matters." He glanced at Bobby. "But I think you know that." In a private conference room, the tape recorder clicked on. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Margaret Pine wasn't always Pine," he began. "Back then she was Margaret Rayburn, nurse at the county hospital. She called it comfort care, said keeping the dying from eating or drinking was merciful." He told them about their mother's death. Margaret had been her nurse. She told the family water would only confuse the body. The pitcher sat full while their mother's lips cracked. Caleb swore he saw it with his own eyes. Thomas had reported her to the hospital administration. She resigned before the investigation could be completed. Caleb believed she'd never forgotten it or forgiven it. Her coming back decades later wasn't chance, Caleb said. It was payback. From his jacket, he pulled another letter, postmarked a week before Thomas died. "She's back. Told Bobby I was ready to go." "Not true. Not until I see you. Don't let her near the well." "What well?" Harris asked. "The one on the cabin property," Caleb said. "She used to test things there." Maya's mind flashed back to the chained well she'd passed on the way to the cabin. The judge granted a warrant for the property search. Deputies returned at dawn. The clearing around the well was silent, the frost on the grass undisturbed except for a single trail of footprints. The wooden lid was warped, the rusted chain cut long ago. Harris shone his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam was swallowed whole. A county rescue team lowered buckets into the water. The first came up full of silt and leaves. The second held a pale blue nurse's uniform, frayed and waterlogged. The breast pocket bore the embroidery, M. Rayburn. Inside the pocket was a sealed jar, the glass clouded. Through it, they could see curled slips of paper. The ink had bled, but some words were still legible. "Third day without water. Family agrees natural passing." Different hands had written them. This wasn't just Margaret's work. It was the work of more than one person. The warrant to search the well had given them evidence, but not answers. The jar with the water-stained notes hinted at a network, families convinced, coaxed, or coerced into ending lives under the guise of mercy. The problem was that Margaret Pine was still missing, and without her in custody, the threads hung loose. Caleb insisted on baiting the hook himself. He left a message at an old number Margaret had once used, a line Maya had traced to a pay-as-you-go phone purchased years ago under one of her aliases. The message was simple. "I know about the well. If you want to talk, meet me there tomorrow at midnight." It was a risk, but Caleb understood her. Margaret wouldn't be able to resist controlling the narrative one last time. The following night, the frost lay thick as sugar on the grass. The clearing was silent except for the occasional whisper of wind through the pines. Harris and 2 deputies crouched in the treeline, barely visible. Maya was farther back, camera ready, watching for the agreed signal, 3 flashes. If anything went wrong, Caleb stepped into the open. The well yawned dark and wide before him. From behind it, Margaret emerged, pale hair neatly pinned, scarf draped over her shoulders. Her presence was unnervingly calm, as if they were meeting over tea rather than in the shadow of an investigation. "You came," she said softly. "You said you had the truth." Caleb replied. Her gaze was steady. Your father wanted you here before he died. He had something to tell you, but you wouldn't have liked it. Try me, Caleb said. Margaret's lips curved faintly. He agreed to my care. He was tired, ready. He knew you'd fight it, so he kept you away. I gave him the dignity he asked for. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's not what his journal says. He was waiting for me. People change their minds when the body starts to fail, she said. You've been running from that since you were a boy. The idea that he might have chosen my way over yours. He took a slow step forward. Then why the ledger? Why the others? Because mercy doesn't wait for permission, she said simply. The body knows before the mind does. I just help it along. From the shadows, 3 flashes of light cut through the dark. Maya's signal. Caleb didn't have time to process it before another figure emerged from the pines. Diego Alvarez, the neighbor's son. He held a heavy wrench, and his eyes darted nervously between Caleb and Margaret. Drop it. Harris's voice boomed from the trees. But Diego didn't move toward anyone. He moved to the well. With a grunt, he hurled the wrench into the darkness below. The clang rang out like a closing door. She told me to close it, Diego said, his voice shaking. Said it was part of the process. I thought it was kindness. Margaret's eyes flicked toward him, cold and sharp. And it was, she said, until you started talking. She moved then, quick, hand darting into her coat. Caleb lunged forward, grabbing her wrist just as something small and glass slipped free, shattering on the frost. A bitter chemical smell rose in the air. She keeps them thirsty, Caleb said through clenched teeth. 2 deputies rushed in, cuffing her as Harris took the broken vial into evidence. Margaret didn't resist. She looked at Caleb with something almost like pity. Your father died with dignity, she said. Caleb's reply was steady. No, but I can take everything from you. In custody, Margaret talked more than anyone expected. Not with remorse, but with conviction. She described Thomas's final days in detail, claiming he'd thanked her in the end. She named other families, other towns, always framing her actions as relieving suffering. The prosecution didn't see mercy. They saw control. Her trial took place a year later. The jury found her guilty on multiple counts of homicide, each tied to a name in her ledger. Bobby Hensley was convicted of criminal neglect but acquitted of murder. The jury believed Margaret had manipulated him, but his inaction sealed his father's fate. He was sentenced to prison time, his release years away. Elaine never faced charges, but her relationship with the town never recovered. Months after the verdict, Caleb drove to the cabin property. The well was sealed now, a concrete cap poured over the stones. He stood there for a long time before pulling a worn envelope from his coat. The one from the basement. Tell Bobby and Ellie the truth if you can stomach it. I never could. He folded it back into his pocket. Some truths were too heavy to hand off, even to family. Maya's coverage won awards, pushing for new regulations around voluntary stopping programs and unlicensed end-of-life care. Families came forward with eerily similar stories, their grief sharpened by recognition. In Milford, the Hensley house stayed dark. Some nights, neighbors swore they saw a figure in the upstairs window, still as a shadow, a glass of water in hand. In Caleb's truck, the pocket watch his father had left sat on the dash. He'd never wound it, but somehow it kept perfect time. The scarf on the porch rail fluttered once in the dawn breeze and then lay still, the knot neat as a signature. Harris stared at it as if it might speak. Ruiz crouched to photograph the fibers, each thread a hairline in the case. Truck tracks, Ruiz said, following the sweep of the ruts down the gravel lane, over the ditch onto the service road. Tread looks like all-terrains, maybe a half-ton pickup. Harris's phone buzzed. Maya had dropped a pin onto his screen, an old quarry road that looped toward the Pine Flats, then narrowed to a trail at the county line. Beneath the pin, a single line. She moves the handoffs. Where the ground eats sound. They rolled. Unmarked sedan eating the distance, siren quiet, speed high. The sky was the color just before. Metal cools. Long shadows ran beside them like anxious hands. At the first fork, a pair of fresh tire tracks cut toward the tree line. Harris killed the engine, the sudden hush loud. In his ears, the smell of wet earth rose from the ditch. A hawk carved a lazy circle overhead, a lidless eye in the morning. On foot, he said. They went in, brush slapping their shins, breath sharpening. The ground still silvered with frost where the sun hadn't found it yet. Somewhere ahead, an engine idled. Somewhere ahead, a woman believed herself the final word in other people's sentences. A voice threaded the trees. Elaine, it's all right. It's better if you rest. A small clearing opened like a held breath. A dark blue pickup was parked at the far edge, tailgate down, a blanket thrown over the bed. Elaine stood near the passenger door, wrists bound in front, her mouth uncovered. Her eyes were steady, angry, awake. Margaret Pine stood 3 paces away, pale hair neatly pinned, scarf loose at the neck. She held her phone like a rosary, thumb stroking the screen as she spoke, not to Elaine but at her. It's better if you stop fighting, she said, voice calm as a weather report. You've been very brave. Everyone says so. On the far side of the truck, a man stepped into view, wiry, restless, beard shadowed in gray. Caleb. His hands were up, palms empty. Elaine, he said, softer than Margaret. I won't let her hurt you. Won't let me. Margaret's smile stayed small. You've let me do everything else. He didn't answer. His gaze slid past her into the trees. He took one slow step forward. Elaine, he said again, when I tell you, get down. Margaret's face tilted. No heroics, she murmured. We're very nearly done. It was Harris's move. He rose, weapon low but ready. Police, he called, voice cracking the clearing. Hands, where I can see them. Now, months after the trial ended, Caleb found his way back to the cabin land. The well was gone now, sealed beneath a smooth disc of concrete laid over the old stone rim. He set the battered pocket watch on its surface and lingered, letting the quiet click of its mechanism fill the air. For us, he breathed, speaking to the fragment of himself that had once lived by other people's commands. Maya's reporting went on to win honors and shift policy, bringing new funding to adult protective services, stricter oversight of so-called voluntary stopping, and better training in how to give real comfort, the kind that never withholds water. Detective Harris returned to his own home, fixed a stubborn faucet leak, and carefully marked a cardboard box in bold black letters. Elaine came to know the low hum of her new kettle and planted rosemary in a small clay pot by the kitchen window. On certain evenings, she poured 2 cups of tea and, without hesitation or apology, quietly returned one to the cupboard. And in Milford, where half the year's mornings carry the scent of frost and the other half the sweetness of fresh-cut grass, people began using plain, unhidden words about water. Sip, drink, offer again, don't leave. Volunteers joined in. Budget battles were fought and won. At the next summer parade, the paper cup of water making its way along the sidewalk crowd was topped off twice as often as the year before. The line kept moving. The cup passed from hand to hand. The world, always a mixture of what it should be and what it should not, went on breathing. Somewhere, a man who had been a son and a brother curled his fingers around the old pocket watch and, matching the beat of its ticking, finally spoke the words he'd carried for far too long. I'm here.